Okay, folks, well, welcome to this meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. My name's David Plum, and my role is just to help facilitate at least part of this meeting. As always, we're here in this Zoom room all together. Climate Council members, people who are our guests today, and then also anyone else who would like to join and observe our meeting. Our general protocol, just to help out with Zoom, is if you're a member of the council or one of our invited guests today, we invite you to keep your camera on. It's particularly helpful to see each other. If you're observing our meeting today, we ask you to keep your camera off until the public comment period. So thanks for that. I'm just looking to see if our chair is here today. I'm looking on our screen. Jane, do you see Kristen?
I know the governor's press conference is running very long right now, so it could be that she's still there.
So why don't we just get going, because we have some really interesting things to do today. Jane had thrown the agenda in the chat, and maybe I'll repost it right now. There we go. Excellent. Thanks, Jane. And so just to walk us through today's agenda, we've got two big things to do after doing our usual of approving minutes and the like. One is Judy Dow is here today. And so for the first hour and 35 minutes or so, the first half of the meeting, we'll call it, Judy Dow is going to lead us through a process that we've asked for, which is a process of moving towards a land acknowledgement by this council. So Judy will lead us in doing that process. We'll take a break at 3:15 and then come back after a break, and we'll invest an hour in the conversation around this memo that you as a council want to prepare around the ARPA funding and priority investments and all the work that's been done by the subcommittees on that. So we'll have an hour to do that at 3:30. Oh, it looks like we actually have a little more than that. We've an hour and 15 if we use those two agenda items together. So we'll hear from the subcommittees, and then we'll figure out what we want to do with the memo. And Jane has some ideas on that to share. I'm just looking at this. We've got some next steps in public comment. We have a little bit before 5 o'clock today, and we're aiming to adjourn at 5. So thanks everybody for hanging in there on this week before holiday. Okay, so that's our agenda for today. And before we go any further, any questions or concerns or suggested modifications to that? Catherine?
Mine isn't agenda related specifically, but I'm just wondering where we're at in terms of closed captioning that I've been asking for several months. Yeah. Are we at a place where we can do that yet?
Jane, what is the status? I know you've been trying to make that work, and there's been a problem with the Zoom account.
I think Marion looked at the settings that Catherine had shared her. Marion, I did not, I will admit.
Yeah, it's something I have to work on with Jane as the account manager. So we're not at a place where we can do that yet, but we'll make sure that we can for the next meeting.
Yeah, I would like to request again that be prioritized, because since something I've been asking about for a while, and I know everybody's busy, but it seems like an important, easy step we should take to make our meetings more accessible. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine, for that reminder. Absolutely. Yeah, thanks. Anything else regarding agenda or other things before we get going? Okay, great. All right, so let me just do this first little piece that we have to do, which is the approval of the minutes. They're linked into the agenda. Feel free to take. Thanks, Jane, for the update on Secretary Clauser. Yeah. The minutes are linked into the agenda. Feel free to open those up real quick. If you haven't had a chance to review them, take a look. I'll give you everybody a moment to just do that. Okay, any concerns or requests for more time on the minutes to look through them? Okay, great. We'll treat those as approved. Thanks, everybody. Okay, all right. So I'm now, unless I'm forgetting something, which I don't think I am, I'm just going to turn this over to Judy Dow and to walk us through a process. And Judy, as we've talked about, we've got until about 3:15. So it's all yours. And if you need help with any tech or taking notes or anything, just Cameron and I are here to help out.
Thank you. Can I share the screen?
You should be able to, yep.
Okay. Awesome. So my name is Judy Dow. For those who don't know, I'm the Executive Director of Gidakina, a Native organization that works with women and their families throughout New England, Wabanaki women primarily. And we've been in Vermont since 2002. And for the last year and a half, I've been working with Shelburne Farms to do a series of land acknowledgements for educators and business people. And it's a 6-hour class. Normally it's 3 2-hour classes with homework in the middle. So I'm going to do my best to condense it into this time and help you the best I can. So here we go. A proper land acknowledgement acknowledges the land first, primarily, and the indigenous people who have cared for the land for thousands of years. It's a protocol that we've had in place to help us always honor and respect the land. It's been in place for thousands and thousands of years. It's a journey to create a relationship with the land. It's called a land acknowledgement because it's acknowledging the land and the story of the land. So there's some questions you should ask yourself when you're thinking about doing a land acknowledgement. It's just not something you're going to sit down and pull out of the air. So ask yourself, where do you live? What do you know about the land that you live on? What do you need to discover? What are some of the changes the land has experienced in the last 4.5 billion years? What is the story of the land's journey? And what are some of the obstacles the land has taken over time? And whose traditional homelands are you standing on? So for instance, you might be standing in Brattleboro, and along the Wantastiquit River, there are remnants of basalt columns left over from volcanoes. Or you may be standing in near the La Platte River in Shelburne. And La Platte River was a creation from the backup of around Salmon Hole that created Lake Winooski, and then backed up Muddy Brook into Shelburne Pond, and Shelburne Pond drained down the La Platte River. And so there's all these stories about the land that, and when you take your journey, you begin to understand how the land has changed in time and why it should be honored and respected. So traditional acknowledgements have been done by Indigenous people for the land. It's a way to be in relationship with the land and to learn and to teach about the land. Indigenous people of North America have used these protocols to acknowledge and honor land a long, long time, for thousands of years. And primarily the stories about the land with a little bit about the people who cared about the land. And that's usually the most difficult part for people to get right in their land acknowledgement. It takes a little research to figure out whose homeland you're on. So it's like you're not always, well, let's ask that question. Can a couple of you tell me where you're from and who are the Indigenous people where you stand? So David, where do you stand? What town?
Well, my home is in Portland, Maine. I am currently in Santiago, Chile, but my home is in Portland, Maine.
Okay.
Yeah, and
So
I was born in Portland, Maine.
So who are the people from Portland, Maine?
So the Indigenous groups in Maine.
Nope. Who are the people in Portland?
Who are the people in Portland, Maine?
Right.
I would be a little bit stabbing in the dark to say specifically who are the people who would traditionally call Portland, Maine their home.
Right. And that's usually where everybody is. So Piscataway or Aroostook, any of those. And when you ask them someplace like Maine, they give you the names of the 5 recognized tribes. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's their homeland. In southern Maine, specifically around Portland area, those were Maritime and Benaki tribes. So they're the same people as us, but different, right? So somebody else, who's the Vermonter? I can't see you all.
Yeah, Bram here. I live in Burlington.
Okay, so whose traditional homelands are you standing on, Bram?
I have always believed I'm on the homelands of the Abenaki.
Well, yeah, that's sort of true. You're on the homelands of the Benaki, but the Benaki is a general term for all Wabanaki people. Whose watershed are you living in?
Don't know.
What? The main river in
I
Burlington.
was going to say the Watersheds, the Winooski.
That's right. And the homelands that you're on is the homelands of the Winooski people. So the homelands of the Winooski people are from the mouth, the head of the waters at Cabot, all the way to the mouth in Burlington. And so the traditional homelands have always been within a watershed. And so you can go from watershed to watershed and figure out whose homelands you're in from basically from that watershed. So Missisquoi would be Missisquoi. There's groups around the Lamoille, there's groups around the Otter Creek. The lower Connecticut is the Sokoke, the upper Connecticut is the Cowes. Now here's the tricky part. If you live Brandon south to the Massachusetts border, that is the traditional homelands of the Mohican people. So you can't generically say you're on the homelands of Abenaki, talking in general of Vermont, because Mohegan are a federally recognized tribe that still have a tribal headquarters there. And anybody living south of Brandon, over to Albany, down to Massachusetts, are living on Mohegan land. And so if you don't say the homelands that you're living on, you're invisibilizing people. And remember, the 4 tribes that are recognized today, 2 of them, Elno and Mohegan, have been created since 2011. They're not historical tribes. So if you say I'm on the historical homelands of the Mohegan, you invisibilized all the people who lived there prior to 2011. So this is how the journey gets to be complex and long. Any questions about that? Okay. So a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes, shows respects, and respects the land on Turtle Island. So our creation story of how this land got here is about a turtle. And when you look at a map and you see North America, you see the turtle. You see Florida's one leg, Baja's the other leg, Latin America's the tail, Alaska's one arm, Newfoundland's another, and the head is up in the center of Canada. So to us, that's Turtle Island. And land acknowledgement should reflect that relationship that exists between Indigenous people and the lands. And again, to understand those stories helps to combat erasure of people. A land acknowledgement is not a welcoming or just a statement. In Australia, Indigenous people do something called welcome to country. This is a welcome as well as the land acknowledgement done by Indigenous folks living there. It's their homeland. So they're greeting people, they're welcoming people, and they're explaining what their homeland is. In South Africa, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was formed in 1995 to help people to heal after apartheid. And that Truth and Reconciliation process created a land acknowledgement, but it didn't work. There's still hard feelings, there's still a lot of pain and a lot of human rights violations around that Truth and Reconciliation. So then between 2007 and 2015, Canadian government entered into the relationship, and they tried with Indigenous people, and they tried to come up with a Truth and Reconciliation program. They were given $72 million, and they worked with 6,500 boarding school survivors. And they asked these people, what can we do to help you? What can we do to help you heal and to feel better and reconnect with the land? And they made a list of 94 statements. And those 94 statements were all collected with the land. They talked about how in boarding schools, they lost their language. And by losing their language, they lost their direct connection with the land. They talked about being relocated and put in various reservations on places that wasn't even their homeland. So all of these things had a direct impact on these people and the ones that were listening. These statements were then put together, and there was a national program, and 7 events were held where the communities learned about the 94 statements that these people wanted. They wanted to be reconnected with their language, with their land, with their historical sites, with everything. And so as part of that, they started acknowledging whose homeland they were on and the land itself. And so this went on for quite a while. From 2007 to 2015, they worked on this. They practiced. People learned how to do land acknowledgements. And slowly, but ever so slowly, it crossed the border into the US. Once it crossed the border into the US, nobody had those trainings. Nobody had that understanding of what happened. So you started to see land acknowledgements that became an I statement. I have this wonderful connection with the land. I walk over hill and dale and swim in this lake, and I do this and I do that. And that's not a land acknowledgement at all. And then you started seeing people acknowledge individuals or institutions or all of these atrocities that happened in this state. Although those things are important, it doesn't acknowledge the land. And that's the purpose of a land acknowledgement. So that's why Shelburne Farms and I have been working together to create these educational classes, because it's pretty painful to sit through a land acknowledgement where they give the homelands you've lived on, you're the 15th generation on that particular homeland, and they give it to somebody else. Totally erase you with one sentence. And so we decided we needed to start educating people, and that's what we've been doing. So land acknowledgements do not exist in the past tense. They must be brought to date. So you can't always talk about they were here, they were there. You've got to say they're here today. Making a land acknowledgement, you're taking part in an act of reconciliation. So you're acknowledging that this was someone else's land and it was stolen. You're taking part in that simply by doing the land acknowledgement. You are taking action, honoring the land and indigenous presence, which dates back over 100,000 years. It's important to understand the long history that has brought you to this land and to seek and understand your place within the history, not change the history of land. So what is your connection with colonization? Where do you come from? How do you relate? I've had people tell me, I came over on the Mayflower, or my family came over 5 years ago. So everybody's relationship is different. Start with a self-reflection. Ask yourself, what is your place on this land? Do your homework. This is the journey that you have to take to figure this out. Research the history, the language, the place names, the history of the land and the people that lived there over time. Because over time it changes, right? This must come from the heart, not an institutional statement shared by all over and over again. So some institutions are creating a land acknowledgement that they say over and over and over and over, wherever they're standing within the institution. That's not a land acknowledgement. That doesn't come from the heart. It doesn't explain where you, what your feelings are with the land, your connection, your journey, and where you are at all. Because the land is not going to be the same in southern Vermont as it is in northern Vermont, which is quite clear this year, because the foliage in southern Vermont was all brown because of some disease the trees got because of all the rain, and the foliage in Vermont and the upper part was colorful and bright. So it's very, very different wherever you're standing. Use historically appropriate and research language. No sugarcoating, but don't be grim. Be truthful. So you're not going to say, there was hundreds of people sterilized during Vermont's egregious eugenics program, but you might mention that eugenics happened in this state. Seek help in learning correct pronunciation of the words. Use the past, present, and future tense. Don't ask a Native American to do a land acknowledgement for you. You are acknowledging this land is stolen. We already know that. We already know this land was stolen. And for us to stand up there and do a land acknowledgement, something we do every day, many, many times, it's many times during the day. And so to ask us to acknowledge something about this land, we already know that it's not a good feeling. Be honest, real, authentic, develop relationships that assist you with creating a land acknowledgement, and understand displacement and its role in the land acknowledgement. So here in Wabanaki territory, 11 families were sent to Carlisle boarding school. Just that one boarding school. A land acknowledgement should not stand alone. It should be part of an action. So don't just talk about it, but walk the talk. So the fact that you're doing the history, to me, to make sure the land acknowledgement is appropriate, that's an action. And sometimes people don't want to do that action. They just want to pull together what they think they know of as history and give an acknowledgement. And that doesn't always work. That's where you get into trouble, and that's where you make mistakes. Sorry about that phone. They're all over my house. That's what happens when you live with an electrician. So that's the end of that. Do you have any questions about any of this? Because that's hard. It's a very different way of thinking, right? It's not a normal way of thinking. No questions? Okay.
A hand from Julie. I see a hand from Secretary Moore, Julie Moore.
Okay.
Yeah, I do have a question, Judy. Thank you for this context. It's incredibly helpful. And I guess I'm just wondering, we had talked about working to develop a land acknowledgement to include in the climate plan, but from what I'm hearing you say, that may not be appropriate. It may need to be more individual than something that could go with the plan. and may need to be more geographically, frankly, specific and nuanced than just talking about the state. And I'm hoping you might speak to that and share your thoughts a little.
Yeah, good question. You're absolutely right. You each should have your own land acknowledged because you're all standing in one place. But the home of this document and the home of where you're going to do this document is Montpelier, right? And so I think it would be appropriate to write a land acknowledgement for Montpelier. And even though you all live in a different place, there's some similarities. There's some differences. And I'd like to try to have you all go outside for a few minutes and tell me what you see. Do you see evergreens? Do you see deciduous trees? Do you have snow on the ground? Do you see the sun? What is it about the land you see? Do you see water? Do you see mountains? And I'm thinking we can take what everybody sees and try to put it together and see if we can form one. Let me read one that I wrote for you for today. Hi, Gizo. So happy to see you today. This sky this autumn has been filled with wonderful tones of gray and large drops of rain. They have continued to nourish this land and now are shared with you with your warm sunshine. I honor your warmth today. Signs that winter solstice is upon us today in everything we see. Each day now, the gray skies will get lesser and lesser. The trees look like the sticks standing in the forest. They dance with a gentle wind as the ground litter crackles from the dry brown leaves below. The wind tells us of the changing seasons, ever so slowly. During the fall, the rain has changed to snow. The evergreen branches bend low now down to the heavy ground, and the snow, while they muffle the song from the chickadees and hide the clumps of grass and fur that warm the nesting rabbits below. Many of the birds have migrated now, and a warm blanket puts most others to sleep for the winter. Little clods of dirt are scattered across my lawn as the voles travel underground, creating a system of tunnels that allow them to move about freely in the layers between the blanket of snow and the ground below them. The bear has not settled in for the winter sleep yet. Their time is short before they rest too. Their bellies are laden heavy with the many acorns and beech nuts that were so numerous this fall. Oh my, an ermine just flit over the stone wall. His color has changed with the waning daylight hours. The black tip of his tail causes his movements to stand out. Such a flexible, soft, and beautiful animal. It's like watching a ballet as he pirouettes across the stone wall. I'm so happy to see these wonderful signs of life on this land that is now starting to freeze deeply as winter finds its way to this beautiful place. I honor and acknowledge the Winooski people that have traveled this land for thousands of years. The very people who lived here within the Winooski's watershed as kin, protected their land as their mother, and has shown respect and responsibility for her care throughout many, many generations. Despite the hardships of war, land loss, eugenics, and forced relocation, this respect, relationship, and reciprocity continues. Today, I acknowledge this land and the people that have cared for her. Aho. And so, as you see, I sat outside and I took note of everything that was around me, everything I could see. I didn't put it all in there, like I could see Mount Mansfield from where I sit. In other land acknowledgements I've done, I've focused on Mount Mansfield. And so there are many things you can see. You can't put them all in there, but I'm thinking we're all going to see some similar things that we might be able to put together to make a land acknowledgement. So do you want to give it a try? Do you want to put your coats on and go outside for 10 minutes and come back with a few sentences of what you see? It's not that I want you to just say, I see white, I see blue, I see, tell me what it means to you. Come from the heart and tell me what you see. Look far and look close. Look at the big and look at the little, because it's all part of the land, right? And if you live in a city, there's cracks in the sidewalks. There's the green belt between the sidewalk and the road. So there's always something in nature. I've taught classes in New York City before, and sometimes the focus was just on watching the pigeons and the patterns they had. So there's nature where you are, and I want to see if you can find it. Come back with a few sentences. So maybe, are you okay with like 10 minutes to get your coat on and go out for a bit? Everybody all right with that? Yeah? Okay, let's do it. We'll see you back at 2:20, say. Is that right? That would be 2:16. Yeah, 2:20. We'll give you a couple more minutes there. Does that work? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. We'll see you.
I'm going to pause recording for everybody, just so you know, and I'll turn it back on when everybody's back.
Thanks, Jane. From Fall. So as you come back, if you could write a few of your things in the chat box that you saw, I think that would be great. And we can start with that. The rest will come back, right? Great, Catherine's already put her comments in. Rabbit prints, blue skies, evergreens, blue jays, chickens hanging out, the sunshine. I love it. I see the barren lilting branches of the willow. Wow, how beautiful, Chad. I see gardens deep in the winter solstice. So do you begin to see how we can put this together? I think we can, those kinds of things are generic enough so we can say they came from Montpelier, even if they didn't, right? Joanna, light snow, frozen ground, beautiful, dark-eyed juncos, fresh snow, awesome. I love it. Oh, on the North Branch, Jane. How nice. Should we start with that? This is where I was, David, this is where I was thinking we could have one note taker and start showing, creating a document together. Is that a
Yeah.
possibility?
Yep, I was literally just sending a note to Cam to make sure he was doing that of cutting and pasting out of the chat into a single document. So Cam, if you're hearing me, if you could do that, that'd be great.
So we've got some people that have been writing down, they're writing down comments from the North Branch, which is directly Montpelier, right? So let's think of, okay, so we got some beautiful comments here about what we're seeing. Lake Champlain looks like a river because the wind is blowing. Yeah, the wind tells a story. The wind tells the change of seasons. Green patches of pine, gray trunks, beautiful. Anybody feel anything? Did you feel the warmth of the sun? Did you feel the cold of the snow? The cold of the breeze? Did you feel any of that? Did you hear, some of you are talking about hearing certain birds. Missisquoi Bay, look at Michelle. The cedars. Nice. Okay, so now if you were doing an individual one, you would start with that. You would start with everything you see and everything you hear and smell and taste, and that you're acknowledging the land. Okay, so we have a lot of these things we'll be able to pull into it. So let's start with the history of Montpelier, not the history of Europeans, the history of the land in Montpelier. Okay, so can anybody give us some thoughts about the history of Montpelier that we can start with? Think back, think back. Okay, so the land is been on a journey in Montpelier. It's been through tectonics, and the continents have collided and separated. In the last 2 million years, there's been over 100,000 ice ages, ice glaciers, and over 100 of them actually have a name. There's been many, many, many volcanoes during tectonics and during all those things. So we can start with that. We can start with a sentence that says, you know, the land in which I stand. Where is Cameron? Are you on a trail? Are you with me, Cameron? Good. So if we're talking about the land within that we stand on in Montpelier, because you've all been there, I'm sure, we can give a couple sentences of history. We know that Montpelier is built in the bottom of Lake Winooski. It was 2 miles wide, and the capital is right at the bottom where it was 100 feet deep. Right? We know that for history. And so we can put all of those into those first sentences, explaining where we're standing. Then we can start taking all those beautiful things you saw today and add them into the context of the story. Yes, perfect. Thank you for doing this, Cameron. And then after a few paragraphs of all of those observations, you're talking about how beautiful that, and Catherine came back and she goes, oh, thank you for this time. It's not a thank you for me, right? It's a thank you to the land to be so beautiful and to fill my lungs with fresh air and to let me feel the sun warm my face. It's a thanking all of those things, acknowledging how wonderful they are, right? Because life would be a bitch without it, let me tell you. And and so go right into that. You're acknowledging all of those things, right? And then you're going to go from that, after a couple of paragraphs, a couple of those wonderful chat things that you have in here, you know, the green patches, you can see the green patches of evergreens. Think about Hubbard Park and what you see up there, right? And the North Branch, the confluence of, let's see, what is it? The North Branch and the Dog River and the Stevens River and all those branches that form a confluence along the Winooski at Montpelier. You want to acknowledge all of those. Because every one of those confluences is an important place in history. It's a place where meetings happened. It's a place where weddings happened, treaties were signed. They're all very important places. And so you want to acknowledge those as part of the history and as part of the story of that land in Montpelier. You're doing a good job keeping up with it. Is there any other history anybody else wants to add of the land? Did everybody know that Montpelier, the capital, is built in the bottom of a lake bed? Kind of interesting, isn't it? Kind of explains why it floods, doesn't it? It sure does. Okay, so we're going to have a few paragraphs with all of that, and then we're going to go into acknowledging the people. So knowing that the Winooski runs through Montpelier, the headwaters is in Cabot, and the mouth at Burlington, the people whose traditional homelands those are belong to the Winooski people. That's their traditional homeland. Okay, and so then we know we want to acknowledge them. We want to acknowledge them for caring for this beautiful land that we just witnessed. All these wonderful things we saw. Is that making sense to everybody? Yeah, I hope. And so then here's where you might mention the history with the people. Okay, so what do we know has happened with the history of the people? You want to acknowledge that they've cared for this land since millennia, right? Since the last glacier and those glaciers before that. So you want to acknowledge and thank them for caring for the land. And you might want to acknowledge the atrocities that they've endured in trying to live with one heart and one mind with the land. And to tell you the honest truth, that's been the hardest thing for me serving on the Ag and Ecosystems Committee, was to look at the land the way I do and the way they do and try to find balance. I couldn't do that. It was so hard for me. But this is where you want to acknowledge that. You want to acknowledge that you're thanking them for caring for this land as long as they have and in such a good way. And that might include, like I had in the one I read to you, all the hardships they had gone through to still continue to do that. So I know that you can all put this together now with all of your comments and create a good land acknowledgement. Do y'all feel like you can now? With all that's here? Yes, yes. Okay, good. And I know we're way early, but you guys are so good. Does anybody have a specific question about the process? Because it's not easy. I mean, it may look easy, but it isn't. And it's hard to write something from your heart because we're trained to write it from our mind, right? But sometimes there has to be balance between your heart and your mind, and that's not easy. So, Dr. Giro, do you have a question?
Thanks, Judy. I think Julie was ahead of me.
Okay,
You weren't? Was that an old hand?
No, I put my hand up, but you were definitely first. So go ahead, Leslie.
Oh, no. No, I wanted to say, Judy, how much I very, very, very much appreciated walking through this and coming to learn more. One of the pieces that really, really struck me is the importance of waterways and watersheds. And I just wondered if you could maybe say a little bit more about that, because, you know, some of the work that I was doing with the International Joint Commission, the waters and watersheds are also important to the peoples. And so maybe if you could just say a little bit more of that crux of
Yes.
our understanding.
Yes, I'd be happy to. So the water is represented in our clothing, in our art, in our basket as red because it's the blood life of Mother Earth. It's the blood life of everything, right? And so the birthing place of the land is a key, the soil, where everything from microorganisms to humans are born. And then the next layer, the next concentric circle out is the spine of the land. It's those same people that were born in a key. And that spine cares for the land because they know there will be no birthing if the land is not healthy. And the next concentric circle is the band's land. It's the land where all the people live in a specific watershed. And they know they must care for the headwaters and that watershed if the spine of the land is supposed to survive and be able to care for a key. If anything breaks down within that component, a key will not be healthy and there will be no birthing. And so the next thing after the band's land is the nation's land. It's the place where everybody speaks the same language and understands the concept of caring for the land. And then the next concentric circle is Yidakina, the land where we have our worldview and you consider the worldviews of others and how it impacts the watershed. But the watershed is everything. It's central to worldviews and it's central to the birthing place of a key. And if you cannot have a healthy headwater, you will not have health anywhere on that river. And those headwaters must be protected. Is that what you meant? Something like that?
It does, and I'm really appreciative of that, partly because I'm on the water chapter of the National Climate Assessment, and so thinking about water holistically from all ways of knowing is something that I'm really interested in. So I'd love to chat with you more as we move forward.
For sure. And so it's not the water is not a thing. It's living. It's another equal person, just like the land is another equal person. And so if you're going to be kind to other people, you have to be kind to the water and the land too, right? Because they are people, they are equal. And until we look at the land and the water as equals, they're not going to be protected. People can try, but they won't be protected unless the water and the land is looked at as an equal.
Thanks again, Judy.
And then, so Julie, are you next?
Yes. And I guess this, sort of comes back to so many of the observations today are specific to today. And even the reflection you shared too, Asa, was so specific to this point in time at the solstice and sort of the conditions as they are on the land and outdoors right now. And I'm wondering if it's even then appropriate to sort of fix in time and place an acknowledgement as, you know, as a council, as part of a plan, or just to acknowledge, is it more a statement of purpose and intent to continue to consider the land as we do this work, and the sort of conditions as they change over time in response to seasons and weather and all of these other pieces? I guess I'm struggling with our ability to do something static versus what I took from this that feels so dynamic, and that's such an important part of it.
You know what I was thinking today? Was thinking how ironic we're doing this on the solstice. You know, so today we have the same amount of light as we do darkness. And tomorrow we'll have a little bit more light and a little less darkness. And the next day, a little more light, the next day, a little more light. And each day that we have a little bit more light, we go into hopefully seeing things completely and not being in our academic silos so much, but looking at this light as a way to see holistically that everything we do will impact our world, our water and our soil, right? And so I think it would be awesome to make this note in the land acknowledgement that you gathered today to create this on solstice, on winter solstice. I mean, that's kind of amazing. And that you're taking this journey beginning when the very next day is going to give you more light. And if that light is compared to additional education, additional knowledge, additional wisdom, that helps guide you through the season, through the years, to do the best you can in understanding all perspectives to make this a good journey for you. It's pretty ironic we're doing this on the winter solstice in my mind.
Thank you. That was incredibly helpful.
Yeah, good. And June, are you next?
Yes, I am, Judy. Thank you. At the December 1 meeting, I recall telling my colleagues on the council that I felt it was imperative at this time in our nation's history to speak with candor and clarity. And so I am with some fear doing that right now.
It's not easy, is it?
It is not. It is my life's work. It is something I have paid for many times over, and I will continue to do so. But it's particularly hard to do it here because so much of what you've said today resonates so powerfully with my own values. I am of a torn mind and heart, though, as I approach this exercise. Exercise is probably not the right word. It seems to me you've handed me a new set of eyes, a new set of ears, new senses, and you've asked me to look at the land through that perspective, and it's been very illuminating to me, very moving. I especially heard you when you said that on your own work on the subcommittee, you found it very difficult to try to balance things because you really felt powerfully allied with a particular sensibility or perspective, which I respect. I have a conflict here because I am on this council as what we call an ex officio member. I'm here by virtue of my office, but what this process entails feels deeply personal to me. And many people on this council have had the pleasure or not, I'll leave it to them to decide, of visiting with me in my official capacity. And I have underscored with them that in the particular world where I work, I am the commissioner of everybody, meaning that I love everybody equally. And so I'm very uncomfortable using my office to express what would otherwise be very personal views, very personal sensibilities. And so I would ask you to tell me, give me advice, Judy, how would you reconcile what feels to me like my dilemma, that I'm here in an official capacity, and I don't feel in that official capacity it's my place to put a particular perspective on the land. In my personal capacity, yes. How would you reconcile that?
It's tough. It's tough because it is a personal journey that you're taking. But for the purpose of this report, I understood it was the goal to come up with a land acknowledgement. And so I can understand not wanting to share your personal feelings on this, but it brings tears to my eyes that if we can't do this, if we can't come together in one mind to protect Mother Earth, what's going to happen to Mother Earth? We got to protect her. We got to do something to protect her. And this step of creating a land acknowledgement is critical to acknowledging that Mother Earth and Father Sky are equal, and we need to respect them. We need to honor them. We need to give thanks for them and reciprocate. If we can't do that, what are we going through all these actions for? I don't know if that helps you or not, June, but for me, we've got to try. We've got to try to work together to create a one mind and one heart.
Oh, it certainly helps me, Judy, to hear your perspective and to receive your advice, and I will have to muddle through it as best as I can. Half of it was acknowledging that I am of a muddled mind and heart here, and I wanted to be true to your charge of coming to this from the heart, because in my heart, I'm having a problem with doing this particular work with this council. And I think I should probably leave it at that because there are 22 other people on the council. But you have helped me enormously, and I thank you for that.
You're welcome. And just so you know, too, I don't believe you are alone. I don't think you are one of 23 with that that conflict within your heart.
Maybe not, but I am used to walking that path alone. So.
Okay. Thank you for your comments. Catherine.
And I'll thank you too, June, because I was thinking something similar. Those who have worked with me a lot will probably not be surprised to hear me say that I don't really think that feelings and work necessarily belong together. Occasionally my feelings do come across, but work is work and personal is personal. And so feelings kind of get muddled in between there. But and so I wanted to thank you, Judy, for challenging me in a personal setting to think with my heart and not my brain. And on thinking about that, I just wanted to express that in thinking about it differently and including this land acknowledgement, I don't think we're doing anything outside the bounds of what's right, because by not doing it, we're simply defaulting to the conceptions of land that are built into our colonialized government and defaulting to that as the right definition of land and how we treat land. And so if we don't have a land acknowledgement, we're defaulting to that and we're not acknowledging that there's more beyond that idea of land. Does that make sense, Judy, what I just said? Is that one of the, okay.
Because it can't be any more personal than the fact that we're talking about our Mother Earth, right? That's really personal on how everybody feels about that. But it's also conflicting to decolonize your mind. And that's what we're doing. We're decolonizing our mind. We're opening our mind. We're clearing our mind to feel like we can talk about this personal issue together and nobody's going to beat us up for it. Does that help? Yeah.
It does. Thank you, Judy. This has been so thought-provoking and so valuable to me.
Yeah, I wish I've tried over the last, what, I don't know how many months to share some of those things with the subcommittee, but it's hard because I feel when I look at the rules of meetings and stuff, I feel like I'm sucking the air out of the room because I'm always talking, because there's not always room for every perspective. And that's what makes it so difficult for me, because everything in my life is personal when I'm talking about Mother Earth, but it's also my professional life. And so they collide every day. Great. Any other questions? I can't see any hands. No? Okay, you men are awful quiet. Is this difficult for you? Is this difficult to talk about the land as your mother? Yeah, say. It is, I know. But you've got, I saw the wonderful comments, from Chad and Jared, and I think that it's in your heart. It's in your heart, and maybe you can put it in words in the paper, but maybe not so much verbally, and that's okay, right? That's fine, because that's what we want. We want a clear mind and an open heart when we're talking about the land and acknowledging the land. Awesome. Thank you.
Judy, I see Bram has his hand up.
Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. Hi.
So I am not going to make any generalizations about the difficulty men having talking about their feelings. But on the subject of the line between personal and professional, I would say, one of the great lessons that I learned from Ben when I worked at Ben and Jerry's was that it is not a law of physics that you have to check who you are at the door when you walk into your office. And it is okay to bring your values and your personality and your fears and your pain with you to work. And particularly this work is going to be really personal for a lot of people, right? We're talking about changing people's homes. We're talking about protecting people's children from the cold and from the heat and from floods. And I would just, feels to me like it's more than appropriate to let this be as personal as it feels like it should be.
Yeah, I agree with you. Thank you for saying that. Because we try to create red lines, and we're not going to cross this line, and we're not going to cross that line, and we're going to be equitable to everything. And it just becomes then this side and that side. It doesn't become something we can work together to create. And I think looking at it in that respect from what you're saying, I think it just makes all the difference when you look at the land that way. So Bram, I have a question for you. If we had talked like this before you started, would it have changed anything on how you looked at the land?
Yes, absolutely. I think kind of looking at watersheds as home instead of as simply a kind of interesting geographic feature is a completely different way of thinking about where we are and the space we're moving through,
Yeah.
among other things, right? Like that's the first one that comes to mind.
Yeah, you're right. So I'm so glad that we've had this chance to talk today, because I know you'll all be going on in this field, and maybe this will help some small way. Thank you. Jane, I see your hands up.
I don't, thank you, Judy, and thank you for so much for being here today. I don't want to cut off the conversation around people's thoughts and feelings and reflections on it, but when folks were ready, I wanted to encourage just a conversation about process from here, about how we see this through to prepare this, and wanted to hear from you, Judy, specifically, because you and I talked about this briefly yesterday, but I don't have a clear picture in my mind on how the best way is to put forward a land acknowledgement now in writing based on, I know that there's a draft. I'm more than happy to attempt to take your words, everybody's words here today, based on the outline provided, and put something forward. Just to June's comments, and maybe to others who are feeling any consternation here, we did adopt at a previous council meeting the expectation that this would be drafted and included in the climate action plan. The process for how we sign on to that, my assumption had been the council would sign on as to the land acknowledgement, but that's also up for discussion, I would imagine, as the council, if that is if that's contrary to what other people were thinking. So our next meeting is likely going to be January 24th. There would be time to put up a draft land acknowledgement prior to that for folks to comment on, and or a small group of us could walk away from here and have a more collective process in drafting as well. So Judy, sorry that was a little disorganized, but for my thoughts, but I just wanted to make sure we, with your input, decided on a process so that we saw this through the drafting.
Mm-hmm. And that's great. I think that's wonderful. And you can add me into the process. I would love to assist further if I can, if there's a smaller group, because we have a really great outline and we have some wonderful comments that could easily put together into a land acknowledgement. And what makes me feel so great about this is everybody contributed. Everybody added something, even if it was just their hearts. That's a big thing, right? So yeah, so whatever process you all decide on, you can add me to it, and I'd be happy to follow through to the end.
Great. Okay. So Judy, I think that brings us to the end, unless there's others that want to share something right now before we take a break. Any other thoughts on this? Okay. It's in terms of next steps. Yeah, I see people in the chat offering to be part of a drafting group. That's really helpful if folks want to do that. And then Jane can take the lead in pulling that together. And Cameron's done a heck of a good job with the writing. And so maybe get Cameron involved in that. But anything else before we take a break here? Well, I, for one, will say, I also really appreciated walking through this with you, Judy. Thank you so much for bringing this conversation to the council. Really, really important.
Great, thank you. It was nice to be with you all today.
Yeah. So why don't we do this, folks? Why don't we take a 14-minute break and be back at 3:10? And we'll be back at 3:10 and we'll go into the next piece of our meeting. So thanks everybody for engaging on this. We'll see you at 3:10. Thank you, Judy, in particular.
Thank you.
Yeah, take care, Judy.
Bye.
Holidays. So the subcommittees met, the three subcommittees in particular met to do what we had spoken about 2 weeks ago, which is to consider priorities for ARPA funding along the lines of what we had spoken about. And so we have kind of a two-step process today to work on that. One is we want to hear what happened in the subcommittees and see the results of that work. So we've asked co-chairs to walk us through the thinking that happened in each of those three subcommittees so we can see that work. Next, we have to figure out, so what does our memo say, given all this? And here, Jane and I and others have done some thinking, and we have some specific ideas we want to test with you as a way of framing up this memo, given the output that we got from you all in the subcommittees. So that's the two-step process. First, hear from the subcommittees, then consider all of this. What are we going to do in our memo, and how to articulate that? Okay. But first things first, let's hear what went on in the subcommittee conversations. We have documents online. Jane had just posted again to the chat the page with everything. I'm just checking those links, Jane. Those are the individual links to the recommendation from the pages from each subcommittee. Got it. Okay. And there is not a particular order, but we could start with the first one that Jane, you threw in the chat there, which is the resilience, excuse me, this is developed by Ag and Ecosystems, supported by Rural Resilience and Adaptation. And so I wonder, I'm just looking around who's with us right now. I see Billy is here. I don't know if Abby's here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Billy, we hear you.
Okay.
Do you want to walk us through how your subcommittee worked through these ideas and prioritizations and the documents that we can have in front of us, particularly that first one that Jane just posted in? And I'm happy to share my screen if you want me to walk through it, or you can too.
I'm happy to share my screen. I'll do that shortly.
Yeah.
So first of all, apologize in advance. I just learned about an hour ago that neither Abby or Lauren were going to be joining us today, and they were kind of leads on a number of these recommendations. So I'm going to do my best to represent what I think they would have to you all. So process-wise, what we did was take the guidance we got from the council, from Doug Farnham and others, on what we believed was ARPA eligible, and kind of the tenor of the council's conversation with him, and asked folks to self-identify priorities within our list of action items. And somewhat organically broke up into groups where people shared interests and tried to come up with composite recommendations that pulled similar and related actions out of our matrix of strategies and actions that we thought were both ARPA eligible and really would make significant progress on adaptation and resilience related to our working in natural lands. So let me share, and then we came back and met as a group, discussed those, did a little bit more refinement, and sent them up to the council. So let me share this document, 1 second. Okay, please let me know when you can see that.
Good, we can see it.
Okay, so that, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4 main recommendations, just so you know what's coming. So the first one focuses on flood resilience, and this was for our subcommittee developed primarily by Lauren Oates and David Mears in conjunction with the Rural Resilience Group, and they may be able to speak to it in more detail. But the idea here is that healthy floodways and river corridors and wetland complexes provide a whole range of climate adaptation and resilience values to Vermonters, as well as a number of other natural resource, clean air, clean water, habitat, and carbon storage and sequestration values. And we believe that at least some forms of protection and restoration in these areas, specifically river corridor easements, are ARPA eligible, since they can be funded through the State Revolving Fund. There may be other investments like certain buyouts, hazard buyouts and things of that nature that can be eligible for ARPA funding. So this is a composite recommendation around a number of actions that we believe may be ARPA eligible that really focus on protecting and restoring these functioning river corridors and floodplains. And when we move over to the Rural Resilience Group, I suspect they will be able to speak in a little bit more detail for this one. I don't know, honestly, where this dollar amount came from. I suspect that's work that Lauren maybe did with the folks in Rural Resilience to look at what is in the hazard mitigation plan and some of these other existing programs that are linked in the recommendation below. So that's what I have there. I don't know how you want to handle this, David, if you want me to just run through the list and then we go back and take questions. Okay.
I think seeing the totality is helpful. So
Right.
why don't you walk through and then we'll do some questions around it.
Okay, so I think, this is both eligible, we believe, because of the SRF eligibility of river corridor protection, as well as, buyouts often targeting lower income populations. The second one focuses on supporting and expanding an existing state program for urban tree planting. This was one of our action items that benefited both additional carbon sequestration and storage, as well as climate adaptation and resilience in our urban areas that have become heat islands, providing clean air, shade in some of our communities that are most vulnerable to heat. This program has been and can be targeted, or these funds through this program can be targeted to lower income communities, thereby being ARPA eligible. And the request for 1.5 million over the 3-year period of ARPA funding would result in about 8,000 trees being planted in these communities. That breaks down to, let me see here. That breaks down to 5,000 small containerized trees for private properties, and then 3,000 larger shade trees for schools and municipal planting. So again, this is an existing program that can be targeted at ARPA eligible communities where there are both climate resilience, adaptation, and mitigation benefits. And this is the amount of money that it would take to administer that program and plant those many trees over the pendency of the ARPA funding. The third recommendation focuses on a suite of actions related to our farm and forest economies. You've heard me say many times that our subcommittee believes that one of the best strategies for climate resilience and mitigation is to maintain our farm and forested landscape, many of which is stewarded by private individuals and families who make a living off that land. And both forest products and agricultural economies are stressed generally right now. Climate change stresses those further. And there are a number of existing programs in the state that provide technical assistance and support and other investments into those economies. And having a healthy agricultural and forest-based economy are really key strategies to maintain those resources for us. There's some question as to whether these actions are ARPA eligible. My understanding is there may be an effort to get the agricultural sector designated an ARPA impacted group. And if that occurs, then certainly on the ag side, these investments would be eligible. And then, I think most interestingly is the one at the bottom here that really focuses on food security and hunger in low income communities, which we know is an eligible group under ARPA. And we had a number of specific action items related to both direct programs that support low income families, as well as some of the coordination and efforts within the hierarchy of food systems to kind of deliver food for Vermonters from Vermont farms. So again, some fairly specific recommendations here we believe are eligible. And again, I don't know exactly where this dollar amount came from. This was something that Abby and others from our group were really heading up. So I'm sure she could follow up with some specifics there. And then the last piece is a very detailed proposal that focuses on agricultural practices that mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. So this is really on the mitigation side, and this is making investments in existing programs that we know are proven to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector. And I think Ryan Patch is on the call with us today. He was really instrumental in pulling this together with others on the subcommittee. So he can certainly walk through this in more detail. But my understanding is that the dollar amount requested is what these programs feel they can implement successfully over the pendency of the ARPA time period. And again, I believe this turns on whether ag becomes an eligible community, but I believe there's an effort to do that. So Ryan, I'll leave it there. We can go back and take any questions. If there's any questions on this specific item, my hope is that Ryan or others from the ag agency could help me respond. So that's what we got. Flood resilience, urban tree planting, farm and forest economic investment, and then ag mitigation practices.
Fantastic. Okay. Thanks, Billy, and thanks everyone for the quick work on that. Do folks have questions for Billy or others in that subcommittee about those ideas? Are there any, clarifying questions or concerns or other things that people want to share right now? Anything not clear? Leslie Ann, please go ahead.
Thanks, David. I just had a question, Billy. Did the topic of trying to make farms more resilient to changes in water availability come up as part of the discussions?
We have discussed that at our subcommittee, that would be a future stressor for agriculture. Certainly, it didn't come up as far as I know when we were developing these recommendations, but that may be something Ryan can speak to.
Ryan, if you're here and you want to chime in, feel free.
Yeah, this is Ryan. I'm sorry. Was this irrigation? I missed the question. I apologize.
Yeah, not necessarily irrigation, Ryan. I was just thinking more generally in terms of drought stressors to agriculture and the ways in which that has played out in the last not just couple years, but a couple decades, and how trying to sort of get ahead of the curve might be one of the things that we are thinking about. And I was wondering if that had been part of the discussions in the subcommittee.
Yes, that definitely has been part of the conversation in the subcommittee. As far as the planning efforts that are needed to understand what infrastructure and management technical assistance is needed for Vermont farms and the specific different types of crops, is definitely an area that requires additional resources to be put there. Whether these ARPA funds can be used explicitly for that planning, I don't think it fits neatly into that bucket. We do partner with NRCS, which has a program that focuses on irrigation infrastructure, and certainly identifying ways that farms can become more resilient during the more periodic episodic droughts in the summer that are happening, and where those sources of water are going to come from or be stored is definitely on the horizon for planning. It isn't front and center in this funding proposal.
Okay, thanks, Brian.
Super, thanks. Anything else? I thought I saw a hand and then it went away. Anything else?
I had a hand up, David, but I think mine more generally goes to the entire discussion. So I'll hold it until we're done.
Great, thanks, June. Yeah, appreciate that.
And I guess all I would add is that, I think I can speak for our whole group that we really feel that, the adaptation and resilience pieces are co-critical with mitigation. And while we appreciate that the ARPA funds may have some limitation in those spaces, that we would hope to see support for other spending to support adaptation and resilience in our communities going forward.
Thanks, Billy. Okay. Great. Okay. If there aren't other questions around that, let's go to the next piece. And why don't I turn Erica and Catherine, if you want to walk us through the work that you all did in your subcommittee.
Sure, and I'm sharing my screen now.
Yep.
So we took the approach in our committee of really selecting some very high level themes and consistent with what we were asked to do. So we, as was noted by Billy's presentation, we worked with the Ag and Ecosystems Committee to come up with a recommendation for $40 to $50 million to focus on flood resiliency. We really see that as crucial in terms of being resilient to the effects of climate change, recognizing that low-income Vermonters are most at risk when it comes to flood resilience compared to middle and upper income Vermonters, and also recognizing that our historic settlement patterns, which are key to reducing VMT and other mitigation efforts, are often and likely located either within or adjacent to floodplains. And so for those two reasons, it's really important that we continue to make investments in flood resilience. We think that there's a great opportunity to utilize existing programs and existing analyses to move forward on these programs, including some through the Agency of Transportation and the Functioning Floodplain Initiative, as well as the new program launched by VEM in this past year that quickly ran out of money because it was so popular. Our second recommendation is related to the grid and communications infrastructure. Clearly, in order to implement the fuel switching and the increased reliance on electrification that this plan calls for, it will be crucially important for us to have a resilient grid. And it's also quite clear that the costs of the resilience upgrades exceed the ability of the ratepayers to pay for that alone, and that there are societal benefits that extend beyond the benefit to individual ratepayers. So in the climate action plan that we adopted, there were actually several recommendations to seek ARPA funding for these key improvements, and we've listed them here. And so I won't read them because you've all read them many times as part of the climate action plan when we adopted the plan. Again, we recommend budgeting $40 to $50 million to prioritize investment in this area, recognizing that we can leverage other funds and pool resources to really take the most beneficial steps first and jumpstart our resilience efforts in grid and communications infrastructure. And then finally, we think it's really important, both in all of these programs that we're identifying for ARPA funding and also as a standalone consideration, to recognize that when the municipal vulnerability index is complete, there would be great benefit to allocating some funding toward those most vulnerable communities to make resilience and adaptation improvements, and also to think about, with all of our other recommendations, whether there should be a method to prioritize investments in those communities identified as most vulnerable. And I invite Erica or Chad to add anything that I may have missed.
Great job. Thanks, Catherine.
I think you nailed it, Catherine. Thank you.
Great. Okay, super. So some thinking from that subcommittee. Are there reactions, comments, doubts, clarifying questions folks have for Catherine and company? Looks like it's pretty clear. Julie, go ahead, please.
I just want to make sure. So is it it's a total recommended investment then, Catherine, of $100 million? It's 40 to 50 in each of those two high level buckets.
It's 40 to 50 million for the grid, for the electrification and grid upgrades, and then 40 to 50 million for the flood resilience. I had connected with Lauren Oates yesterday about the flood resilience piece. They were recommending 30 to 40, but just given the scope of some of the programs that already exist that we're talking about enhancing, we had said probably 40 to 50 million is more appropriate to go in terms of an ask, but I see it didn't really get changed in what was posted. So,
and to clarify, that's collectively the two committees are recommending that as a total. We're not each recommending that amount added together,
okay.
But it's a collective recommendation.
That's helpful. Thank you.
I was just going to highlight that when the subcommittees are done speaking through their recommendations, I have a table in the PowerPoint that's on the website that I was going to show with a couple slides that shows all the projects listed and the total amount being asked for everything.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it yet, it was really helpful. Thanks for doing that, Jane.
And then I did have one other question, which was I know sort of at the 11th hour we talked a little bit about all hazards and flood hazards, and just wondered if that factored into your conversation at all about flooding. I think the thing that's probably front of mind for me would be something like cooling centers, but didn't know if that was part of the discussion as you develop these priority recommendations.
It didn't really come up in our conversation at the subcommittee level in terms of prioritizing funding for this recommendation. I will note though, there are some conversations going on right now with ACCD around a program proposal they've put together on enhancing community centers and downtowns, and we're looking at whether we can create a co-benefit of also incorporating, like putting generators on those community centers and incorporating them for heating and cooling shelters. So that is one conversation that's happening. It's just, kind of in development right now. It's outside of this scope.
And it did come up tangentially in the conversation about the grid resilience in the grid, and in identifying where to focus that places where we may be having and developing cooling centers was something that we should think about in terms of prioritizing the resilience efforts.
Super. Jane, is that you're an old hand or a new hand? Okay, great. Other reflections or comments on what this subcommittee is putting on the table here? Okay, great. Okay. Again, thanks for very quick work and turnarounds and thoughtful turnaround. Cross-sector, let's talk about your conversations and where you landed. I'm not sure who wants to present, Rich or somebody else. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, let me start by asking Joey if she would care to present the transportation recommendations.
Sure, I can. Yeah, or Peter, I don't know if one of you, like the others, just wants to fly through them all together. And
why don't Rich, why don't you get started? I'll share my screen so folks can see them. How about that?
Thanks. So we have recommendations in the transportation sector, in buildings and thermal, in electrification, and also in non-energy. So we went through all 4 of the issue areas that the subcommittee has paid attention to. And the numbers appear in the chart that Jane put together. EV incentives for low and moderate income Vermonters. I'll start with transportation. Specifically, replace your ride and mileage smart. In order to accelerate those programs, we recommend that the legislature consider a broad funding range of between 100 to 150 million. One of the really important transition requirements for moving to electric vehicles will be electrical upgrades, particularly for low and moderate income households. And so we envision a program using ARPA money to facilitate EV charging capabilities, particularly in low and moderate income housing, in multifamily housing, and within qualified census tracts, to accelerate and make possible the transition to electric vehicles. And it looks like around 27 million would be needed to meet that need. And we mentioned, by the way, the importance of investing in infrastructure in community centers in order to facilitate the development of compact settlement patterns. This is in line with recommendations from other committees. In the building sector, we have really 3 recommendations. The first echoes something I just said about electricity. In order to make Vermont buildings ready to be electrified, and both for heat and for transportation, we need a significant amount of electrical upgrading in quite a number of buildings. And we envision that being implemented in coordination with a weatherization program. So when we weatherize programs, when we weatherize a building, we will also make it ready to be significantly more electrified. And about 25,000 units we figure could be done using ARPA money. With respect to weatherization, we strongly support the Weatherization at Scale initiative. And the idea there is to make ready 25,000 households using the ARPA funds over the next 4 years. That would cost somewhere between 122 million to 147 million. Peter, why don't you talk about non-energy?
Thanks, Rich. So as we've talked with you in the past, one of the key pieces to address one of the areas where we have rising emissions is in refrigerant management use, which is in the high global warming potential chemicals. We have a few options here that would be tailored to different needs of different impacted businesses. You could look at things at options from as simple as leak detection systems to rehabilitation of existing systems to replacement with systems that do not have the high global warming potential chemical use. We anticipate that for a $20 to $40 million price tag could have a significant impact. Obviously, there are some questions about eligibility relative to this, but we certainly think that we could go down this path and find some opportunities for eligibility, because many of these businesses were highly impacted over the course of the pandemic. They haven't been specifically identified as of yet, but we know that's sort of a moving target.
Happy to take questions.
Is there anything else you need to say on the electricity one there? The 200 amp service piece?
Liz, you want to speak to that?
Or TJ if he's on, but no, I don't think there's more that needs to be said. It can be pretty well combined with the types of upgrades that were specifically recommended for EVs. And the key really, from our point of view in talking about it, to put the recommendation forward is to do whatever possible to ensure that that funding stream for those types of upgrades are easily available to the Vermonters who are also accessing, for example, weatherization programs, so that people can get what they need at the same time to the maximum extent possible.
Yeah, well, one of the problems with the weatherization program, which I think you all have heard, is that historically it's very constrained with respect to what the money can be spent on. It historically could not be spent on heating system changeouts, and it couldn't be spent on electrical system upgrades for the most part, unless there was a really emergency kind of situation in a unit. And if we are talking about going into people's homes to weatherize them in order to reduce emissions, we recognize that significant emission reduction actually comes from changing the heating system and changing the transportation, the vehicles that household is going to use. And so building both the capability for heating system switch outs and the capability for electric charging, vehicle charging, as part of a building upgrade, getting it done all at once is what we've been excited to talk about.
Excellent. Thanks, Rich. Okay. Questions, comments, thoughts on the cross-sector ideas here? Any doubts that people have? Okay. Okay, great. So that's the hard work of several subcommittees going back to work and trying to identify these priority areas. Now we have a dilemma in front of us, right? Because we identified a whole bunch of great ideas and we put some preliminary price tags to it. And that price tag is obviously significantly more, multiples more of what the allocated ARPA funds that we understand are available for this work. So we need to think about what this memo would say. And I think this is an opportunity for Jane, if you want to put some ideas on the table. about that. And I think this is the next part of this conversation, is saying, what do you as a council actually want to say about the guidance you're giving? So Jane, take it away, please.
I'm happy to, but I do see Commissioner Tierney and Joey's hands are both up. So happy to pause for questions first. Recognizing we're
let's
like
do it.
way ahead of schedule too. Not sure I've ever
That's
said
always
that.
jinxing
Please,
us
go
bad.
ahead.
Jim, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I'll try not to eat into that surfeit of time that we've earned. This too is a moment where I speak with some trepidation, but I feel I need to be clear and candid with the council. I do not plan to be an active commentator on this process. I have given the input that I have and did so in the last meeting. This is where the tension of being a member of Governor Scott's cabinet meets very squarely for me with the mission of this council. As many of you know, the governor is, as we speak, preparing his budget, and he is entitled to my counsel on that. And I don't feel it's appropriate for me to be making recommendations here and then turning around and advising him on his budget priorities. So I intend to abstain from the conversation. That way, none of you will feel that I have exacted any concessions in this process from you. And I don't know whether we have a voting mechanism for this or not, but I wanted the record to squarely reflect that I'm abstaining from this part of the work.
Thanks, June. I appreciate you saying that explicitly. And we don't have actually a little voting tool like we used on December 1st right now. If we need to pull something out like that, we will. But thanks for that clarification. Joey?
I wonder, I can defer to Secretary Clauser first, because I don't want to derail the conversation in case she wants to follow on Commissioner Tierney's. So.
Yeah. Secretary Clauser?
Thanks. I appreciate that. I am just going to echo June's sentiments. I think it's something that all of the appointed members of the administration are dealing with. And, you know, I think as we discussed, there are resources available for this work, but it's a finite pool of resources and layered with ARPA requirements and the members of the administration. And I certainly invite them all to speak up if they would like to, but we cannot make specific proposals for projects with specific funding associated with those projects outside of the governor's proposed budget, which won't be publicly available until January, and we are in the process of formulating right now. So I don't want to pile on too much of what June said, but just make it clear that I think it extends beyond June and reaches really all of the members of the administration who are in a just unable to get out in front of the governor's recommendations when it comes to specific allocations for specific policies.
Thanks so much. Yeah. Is there anything else on that topic before we go to Joey's point?
I did want to ask, and I wonder, just for clarity from the administration, in my conversation, understanding about this and the way we were going to propose advancing this conversation is to propose it as a suite of recommendations without funding allotment. And so I'm curious how the administration can or can't engage in signing or considering signing onto a memo as a climate council that speaks to principles that are being put forward by the council for consideration of climate action priorities, and then a suite of climate action priorities listed in a memo, but not associated with specific funding recommendations. Just wondering if that's different, and it may not be, but.
I think high level priorities are different, but it's hard to, and I invite others to jump in. It's hard to answer the hypothetical. I think we'd have to see what we'd have to see what it looks like, and then we can weigh in. But certainly, high level priorities, lifting, depending on what those are, but lifting certain things or highlighting certain projects as being a higher priority or more important than others contained within the action plan, I think is very different than here are the specific recommendations and specific recommendations for funding.
June?
Yeah, I think Kristen did a very nice job of nailing that. And to that, what I would add is that certainly in the cross-sector subcommittee, the department made its expertise available as a matter of technical analysis in analyzing the priorities articulated in the plan and providing some sense of scale and the like as to what the funding requirements would be. But we've crossed over here, and this is not by no fault of the committee or the council, I might add. We're now crossing over into a territory where targeting specific funding results, meaning resources, that's a very specific statement. And I just can't see how I give you my specific 2 cents on that without on some level disclosing what I'm telling the governor, because I'm one person speaking to these issues. So I think, this is a question of trying to find a reasonable interpretation of the statute. And I think I've landed there as a council member. So that's how I would answer that, Jane.
That's great. I think, why don't we keep that in mind as we look to what this memo might be and might not be. And then we'll circle back when we finish this conversation and see how we land there. Joey, you've been patient. What did you want to say?
Well, now a few random, but connected in the total of the conversation things. So I can appreciate what you all are saying. I would say for us, a few things to note on the transportation sector recommendations. We really thought about it through the lens of ARPA, and you'll see that we didn't recommend anything related to like EV charging infrastructure because we were thinking about other pools of money that we anticipate. So the infrastructure bill, anticipating that could help with the EV charging, for example, and potentially other things. So I just wanted to note that because it didn't come up in the overview. I would also just say one of the questions I have is this, are we all focused on the 200 million for CAP implementation? Because this is a lot more what we're putting on the table of important priorities that we want to, give our guidance and thoughts around to the legislature. Clearly only guidance. I mean, I think what we are doing here is based on a year's worth of work, just giving them a sense of our thinking and the scale, which is why I think, the dollar amounts are important, helpful guidance to give the legislature a sense of the scale and the pace that we need to, be making these investments. But I know there are other pockets of ARPA dollars out there that could support some of the stuff, particularly the resilience and adaptation work. And so my question is, I don't want us to be constrained by the 200 of CAP implementation only. I think there's a lot of important priorities, and I'm just wondering how others have been thinking about what we're putting forward. And it may not just be directly related to urging the legislature to pull from the CAP implementation dollars, I guess is what I'm suggesting. And then lastly, for the second time in cross-sector mitigation, I think we've had some pretty significant news that delivers a little bit of a blow or a reality check to what we're talking about. And now that's the uncertainty about Build Back Better. So when it comes to the mitigation space, the Build Back Better bill would have provided a really important catalyst for the kinds of innovations and investments we need to be making. And that remains unclear and potentially unlikely. So I think that's a dimension that we really need to consider and think about how it impacts our work and this conversation and the planet.
Yeah, thanks, Joey. I think it'd be really helpful to hear from Jane about what this might be. And so Rich, if you got something quick you want to do, let's do that. And then I think it'd be helpful to put some ideas on the table what this is and what it might be. I see Jared just put his hand up as well. But Rich and Jared, something quick, and then let's talk. I think there's some information here that might help guide this conversation. Rich, go ahead.
Agreed. And maybe Jane will say this, following up on what Joey just said. We don't know everything we need to know about the budget, about other funds that are available, about what's going to happen with Build Back Better. We just don't know. And we're not in a position as a council to be a budgeting organization because we don't have all those threads available to us. So I hope that what Jane is going to tell us is that we can make recommendations to the legislature without trying to be the budgeting committee, and that we can, in particular, create a statement of principles about how we think they should be looking at the problems we're addressing. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah. Jared?
So just one thing that I would hope that we can end up with is a recognition that, regardless of what the recommendations may or may not be, and I would agree with Rich that I do hope that they are at least at a kind of high level around criteria and priorities that we recommend the administration and legislature consider, and that we identify possible investment areas that would meet some of those criteria and priorities. At the same time, I think it's really important that we communicate that this is for a moment in time and subject to further revision as additional information becomes necessary. And I'll just give two specific examples of that. We just had a meeting earlier this week where we're talking about, the process for finalizing the pathways analysis that underpins the cap. And one of the pieces there, one of the deliverables that we will be looking to towards the end of January is a marginal abatement cost curve, looking at further information to inform some of the most cost-effective emissions reductions in terms of dollars spent per emissions avoided. That could end up being really helpful information in this conversation in January, February, March. We don't fully have it yet now. I think the other one is, you saw a pretty broad range on those EV incentive recommendations. One of the factors there is that, Build Back Better was looking at expanding the federal EV incentive from a maximum of $7,500 as a refundable tax credit to a maximum of $7,500 as a tax credit to a maximum of $12,500 as a refundable tax credit. If that does not happen, the meeting the scale of vehicle electrification will, perhaps require, more investment than we've been thinking in the presence of Build Back Better. So those are just two specific examples that I think highlight and underline a point that I would really hope is present in these recommendations, that they are preliminary and that they're subject to kind of further analysis and information coming to light that should inform kind of, the more detailed parameters as this conversation proceeds in the coming months.
Thanks, Jared. Okay, let's carry that thought forward as well. And I wonder, Jane, you've got just two slides here. One is that table, and the other is a sort of idea about how to channel some of this angst that we're hearing right now. And so why don't we look at these and walk us through the thinking here.
Okay, great. So I did just want to be illustrative and put all the actions that were being recommended from all of you up in one table. Thank you to Marion for helping do this. All of the funding is there on the right. You can see that it far outweighs the amount of ARPA dollars that we have, but mindful of what Joey was saying, it's really a consideration of climate action broadly and what the priorities are as lifted up by the subcommittees for federal funding coming down the pike. These are in no way listed in any order of priority. And then, of course, Catherine and Erica spoke to also the priority of rural resilience to be able to set aside potentially some of the funding in order to have it available once the municipal vulnerability index was developed in the coming year to years. I didn't put that in the table, mindful that I thought I was thinking of that a little differently and that we might lift that up as pointing to that tool for future allocation of federal resources, but that my gut was that it felt too time sensitive of a request around ARPA to actually consider holding funds and rather spoke to the potential for that, would speak to the potential for that for future allocations. Let's see. So really, we were thinking about how to propose this in a memo that would be drafted pretty quickly after today, mindful that these processes are unfolding with the governor prepared to do a state of the state right the day after the legislature convenes. And so wanting to put together a memo on behalf of the Climate Council, and we can talk about that, what that looks like now, understanding the position of the administration today, how to put that forward on behalf of all of you in the coming days to be able to influence the thought process behind both the governor and then ultimately the legislature during the session this year. So really wanted to frame these ideas as putting them all forward in no priority order. We really didn't think that understanding the time we had today and capacity, that there would be any benefit of trying to weed through the actions being put forward by the Climate Council. And rather than trying to do that, it would be more of a better use of all of your time to set up the framework and speak to the principles that we would hope that would guide the decisions ultimately of the governor and the legislature in how they think about funding climate action, and have your actions as consideration for proposal for recommendations for them to think about as they do so. So thinking about that the table that we have would be something that would be included up front in the memo, but may not, would not speak to funding specifically, as I was saying, but rather we could attach the memos that were included today for all of you as appendix, addendums to that memo in order to give some more clarity and depth to what the ideas are and some bounds on what the funding makes sense. And then really use the memo to tee up the need to balance funding for emissions reductions and adaptation and resilience, use the guiding principles and scoring rubric to inform decision-making around funding and the implementation of the program, and then recognizing that the conversation you all had last time at the council level about thinking about speaking to the way New York is prioritizing a percentage of funding for equity, as well as Biden's 40, that with this really, because of the priority for low-income Vermonters, that funding should be directed primarily and overwhelmingly toward low-income Vermonters, and that's consistent really with ARPA funding conditions as we know it. So in addition, the one thing that I did want to say is appreciating that ARPA, while the criteria for funding with ARPA feels like there's a lot of gray area, we also appreciate that some things are really clearly fundable by ARPA, and that we would want a statement that says we recognize some items are more straightforward for meeting the criteria for ARPA funding, and others may have a higher risk of not meeting the criteria, and put forward that the council did not feel positioned to make that judgment today based on the time allotted to us, and appreciate that as the recommendations are considered by the legislature and governor, that their expertise should come into play in how they think about what actions they want to carry forward and prioritize for funding. So really, for us, it's about putting forward the suite of ideas that you've all come up with and speaking to really these 4 core principles in how we balance and put forward the memo to the governor and the legislature in the coming week. So I'll stop there. That's really what I have for discussion. And then ask all of you to think about how you'd like to make any refinements or more specificity to that as we consider the conversation.
Thanks, Jane. And if you could just keep that on your screen for 1 second, let's just keep looking at it for a moment. And, you know, for instance, I can imagine, Jared, if you look at it, you might say, let's put a 5th bullet in there that we encourage you to, you know, take into account emerging information such as what we will blah, 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 right? So you could make a 5th bullet, for instance, around, you know, paying attention to emerging knowledge and information that we expect will come out in the coming months, for instance, right? Okay. Secretary Moore?
I just looking, I think, to make sure there's a point of clarity around, Jane, what you have is the second major bullet, that the priority actions add up to more than the allocated funding. I think we probably need to be clear about whether the funding recommendations are in an endeavor to be consistent with the sort of magnitude presented in the cap, whether they're what we think is actually achievable during the fairly short timeline that ARPA funds are available, or both. But I don't know what kind of guidance we're providing, and I think that clarity will be important.
Yeah, and we framed that with the subcommittees when we were talking about this, in that we asked subcommittees to put forward not only funding in order to meet the necessary targets in the emission space, for instance, but really to think about what we were capable of putting on the ground, understanding the 3-year timeline for getting the funds obligated. And so my understanding and expectation based on what the subcommittees have done is to put forward a maximum that was spendable in the period allotted with ARPA.
Okay. So how do people feel about this? How do people feel this being your memo, right? A narrative version of this, right? This is the bulleted version, but essentially a narrative version of this, attaching your documents from the subcommittees as annexes and emphasizing these principles that are in here. Rich, go ahead, please.
This is exactly what I was hoping we would do. So yeah, I think we should have a cover memo with principles stated. I would amend these bullets just a bit. Jared spoke to the importance of spending the money cost effectively to meet the objectives of the Global Warming Solutions Act to the greatest degree possible. And certainly with respect to emission reductions, that should be a clear statement. And further down, I think we should primarily and overwhelmingly towards low income. It seemed to me that we were really speaking about low and moderate income Vermonters. And a lot of the program activities that we are promoting are indeed targeted towards low and moderate both. So I think I would add and moderate income Vermonters to that bullet. And I don't know that we need overwhelmingly. I think primarily is strong enough.
Okay. Okay. So 2 specific suggestions about changes there, Rich. One is among the principles, talk about cost-effective use of funds to meet the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act, right? And that can be combined with something Jared says about being attentive to emerging information that helps make those judgment calls that we may not have at our fingertips right now. And then the second point about in that 3rd bullet, talking about low income and moderate income Vermonters. And it sounds a little bit like overkill to have primarily and overwhelmingly, right? So primarily is probably sufficient. Okay, those are some specific suggestions. So I would encourage folks, if have a different view about that, to speak up, right? Because right now what we're trying to do is make a new version of this that feels, or a refined version of this that feels good for everybody. Jared?
Just briefly, David, sorry to interject, David. and Jared, I just wanted to respond, and I can't find my hand with the screen sharing. We talked specifically about the low-income Vermonter bullet, and my suggestion here in this space, because when David and I were talking, and Marion were talking about this, I identified that cross-sector in particular had identified expansion to think about moderate income Vermonters with weatherization and other programs. So my sense, understanding what ARPA requires and the focus on low income, is that if we said something like funding should be directed primarily toward low income Vermonters, I think that is a stronger statement and what we mean, and it also leaves the door open for some of the funding to go to moderate income Vermonters, appreciating that still primarily should go to low income. Yeah. Thanks, Richard.
Great. Thanks, Jane. Jared?
Yeah, one suggestion on the first bullet. I don't necessarily feel like it's our best thinking. I feel like it's our current thinking, given the information available, and the kind of fantastic short that relate subject to further analysis and further review. But I do think that the framing is important there, that it is the current thinking based on the information we have at hand this date, subject to further kind of.
Thanks, Jared. Either you were cutting out or I was, but yes, maybe best thinking is too strong. It is our current thinking that we were able to provide right in the time allotted. Okay, great. And I'll add on to that Secretary Moore's comment that we started, where when we talk about recognizing the priority actions add up to more the allocated ARPA funding, you can add in a bullet saying subcommittees looked at what would be a spendable amount given the scale of what's needed and what's possible. So we could add in that comment that Secretary Moore made as well. Okay. Other thoughts that would help people feel comfortable with this approach to a memo?
Sorry, David, if I can, I just want to add another kind of consideration as either a principle or a criteria, and that is, I don't know as much about this as I wish I did, anyway, the point is, I know that there are multiple federal funding streams. There are multiple streams within ARPA. There are different kind of criteria and eligibility. And I do think that maybe it goes without saying because it's so obvious, but I do think it's worth kind of enshrining here that should be assessed which recommendations are eligible for different kind of streams or pots of funding. And if there are some that are eligible for multiple areas of funding, whereas some are only eligible for one, I think there's a principle, I don't know exactly how to state it, but wanting the dollars to go as far as possible, do as much good, achieve as much leverage as possible. And so, if there's a really important recommendation in here that can really only fit under one criteria of one specific ARPA fund, that may be different than some of these that are eligible under other uses or other pots of money that have been identified. And I just think that needs to kind of be kept track of and assessed. The other thing I think I don't want to get into too far because I worry it would not be a productive discussion, but I do worry that the word balanced suggests equal funding. And I do think that it is important to convey that in order to meet some of the legal requirements, it may be necessary to invest the amount identified or more in some of the mitigation scenarios. And so I don't think that's up to us as a council to decide. I think that is up to the legislature to weigh the relative kind of priority and commitments. But I do worry that I think that I would be more comfortable with a bullet there that says a mix of funding for these different things, but balance to me suggests kind of an equality between things that may not be appropriate given the structure of the GWSA and what the legal requirements.
Got it. Okay. Great. I'm trying to take some notes as you types. Apologize. Okay. And I'll just, as a quick aside for, those of us who were involved in trying to write this, balance did not equal 50-50. That was not the intent of that word. So let's get the words in the way we want to. Catherine?
Yeah, I didn't read balanced as meaning exactly equal 50-50. I read it as a balance among the competing needs. And so I was okay with the balanced word. But I just wanted to note that reflecting on Jared's comment about how there's different funding sources and et cetera, perhaps we could just add a line that just notes that we recognize that the legislature and the governor will maximize available resources across ARPA and the infrastructure bill to move a host of priorities, including these, and just recognize it in the context of larger funding opportunities beyond just that, not just because I don't want to diminish the amount allocated toward the cap, but there's funding beyond that could be available for some of these priorities.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Are there other things that would make this stronger? Okay. So just as some very crude notes, if you want to drop for a second, Jane, your share, I'm going to share mine. Sorry, and I don't have my usual setup today, so I'm a little bit slower. So here's some just bullet pointed revisions based on the conversation we've just had. And obviously this is not the end of the conversation. I'm just saying what we're capturing. So it feels like we need another bullet around the principles that speaks to cost effectively allocating funds to meet the objectives of the GWA and also being attentive to emerging information that may come out in the coming months. That are the way we talk about the direction of where this is for low-income Vermonters, middle-income Vermonters. Rich, I'd like to test this with you because you brought this up. What Jane puts out there is maybe we leave directly primarily to low-income Vermonters, but that obviously leaves the door open to others, middle-income and others. We need to tone down our language around best thinking and the first piece of first bullet. And we need to mention that we're looking at that we assume that the governor and the legislature will be looking at other streams and that assessment should be done. And we assume that the legislation and the governor will maximize the use of those different streams accordingly. To Secretary Moore's point about subcommittees did look at the scale of action needed to meet the needs of the cap and also the amount that could be spent in the time frame, and that's what those dollar amounts reflect. And that the word balance doesn't mean 50-50. So those are some of the things that I was just jotting down as you all were speaking. Rich, I see your hands up. Is that a new hand?
It's a new hand. I want to answer your question. How could we make this stronger?
Yeah.
There's an implicit point that we don't state, but that I think deserves stating. Due to the urgency of the climate crisis, we urge the legislature, or it's a key principle here, that the opportunity to invest ARPA funds be seen through the lens of taking actions to address Vermont's climate goals. That ARPA isn't just about recovery from the crisis or in the usual course of business. We are urging looking at this through the lens of climate.
Great. Okay. Great. Okay. And Rich, are you okay if on the issue of directing primarily?
Oh, yeah,
Low income?
You didn't see me do it, but I was doing thumbs up on that.
Okay.
Okay.
Super. Thanks. Okay. All right. So this is where we're headed, folks, right now, is we're headed towards a memo that pulls in these ideas and has this cover piece, and then the annex is the work that you've done in the subcommittees. Okay. We have to figure out how to do that, right? I think Jane's probably going to be in the hot seat in terms of actually turning these bullets into prose. And Jane, if you want to say a word about the timing and how you want to do that, or if the steering committee might be helpful in providing some comments to that prose, like what's your thinking on that?
Yeah. So I meant to include a process on the memo for you all to consider, but not having one and thinking of one now on the fly. My question to all of you is appreciating that this should be done before the holiday is my understanding and expectation. So the turnaround being, by the end of the day on Thursday. It would be great in concept to agree to the memo on behalf of the council based on the framing that David just did with those additions to what we had originally proposed. And then if you can empower me to draft it, the only question that I have is around review. And I had originally asked or thought in my mind that the steering committee made sense for that quick turnaround, but knowing that half of the steering committee is on vacation this week already, and a couple are administration officials who I believe are abstaining at this point from the memo. I wonder if it made more sense to have a handful of volunteers who are willing to work with me between now and Thursday just to review the memo on behalf of the council.
Nice
Open to using the steering committee also, but my preference, just understanding the short time frame and appreciation of folks on leave, might make sense just to have representatives today volunteer.
So the specific request, if someone wants to raise their hand to say, yep, I'll happily do a back read for you, Jane, and I'll do that in the spirit of everything I've heard in this meeting, not just my own particular view on it, right? That's the hand raise we're looking for. Okay. And Rich, is that hand saying you're willing to do that? Okay.
I think Jane will do a terrific job. I'm not worried about it at all. And I'm happy to be a second set of eyes if that's helpful.
Great. And I see Jared in the chat is doing that as well. And others, please raise your hand if you're willing to do a quick back read on this. Okay. I want to be very explicit to what's happening though right now, just so that we're taking these bullets, including the revised bullets I just shared on the screen, and turning that into a very simple prose, right? I think a less is more situation in this is what we need to do. And then we're gonna paste on as annexes the documents that you all from the subcommittee sent up, the ones that are already online that we looked at today. That's the process that we're looking for, and we're looking to do it in the next 2 days. Catherine?
I just didn't want to move on without acknowledging the concerns, the very valid concerns that the administration appointees raised. And so if we need to add a line to the letter that states, the Climate Council, other than the administration designees, deliberated on something like, anything like that we need to add as a qualifier to give you comfort. I think those are extremely valid concerns, and we don't want to move forward without acknowledging them somehow in this permanent piece of writing that we put forth.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm so glad you said that. That was the very next thing I wanted to do, which is circle back to the administration folks and say, okay, this is the plan now. What, if anything, do you need to put in there, like what Catherine suggests? Is it a line or is it nothing? Is there something you would need to do to reflect what you spoke about earlier?
Thanks, David. Catherine, I really appreciate that request. And I would love the opportunity after the memo is drafted to take a look to see if something additional, a line is necessary, especially given, we were going to abstain to the extent that there's voting mechanism. But if it's a memo without a vote, it might be necessary to add a line depending on how the memo comes out. And I appreciate the suggestion, and I would love to have the opportunity to take a look to see if there's something we would add.
Great. Okay.
I would think even if we had taken a vote, still including something like that in this memo that could get circulated outside of the minutes would really be helpful for all of you to make the message clear.
I agree. Thanks for the suggestion.
Great. Okay. Wonderful. What else, folks? Any further thoughts or concerns about what'll happen over the next 2 days with this memo? Okay. So let's consider that agreed to by all of you, and thank you for that. Let's do, we had on the agenda some next steps on this. Jane, is there something we need to say around next steps before we do public comment?
Yeah, yes, please. I wanted to draw everybody's attention. I just dropped in the chat. Originally, when we met last time, our hope had been to get you all the final appendices for the climate action plan with enough lead time that we could adopt them today to be added to the website with the plan. That didn't happen for a number of reasons, but Marion did a great job of putting together a single Word document that now has the hyperlinks for all of the appendices -1. That is what is in the chat right now, the Word doc with the hyperlinks, except for the Vermont Pathways report, which was brought up earlier and is still being finalized and likely won't be finalized for a month. And so we'd like to move forward with approving the appendices, and our thought process for how to utilize the appendices and make them available to the public is beyond this, the one single page document that has all of the appendices listed. Our intent on the climate change website, where the plan is listed, is to have not one PDF of all the appendices, but rather to have individual links to the 16, I believe, appendices that are currently there, so that you can hyperlink specific on the page to each appendix that we've chosen to highlight. So we'd like to leave this out and ask that if you have any comments or questions about our process or approach, that you let us know before the holiday at the end of this week. I don't expect there to be any, and so I'm hoping that's not a big ask of you all, appreciating that these are final documents and it was just a matter of pulling them all together. The only new documents that you'll see here on the list is the dissenting opinions documents and the signing statements. We compiled the signing statements into one document and added a cover page, and the dissenting opinions are compiled into one separate document and have a cover page as well. And so if you have any questions or comments, let us know. Otherwise, we'll move forward with putting them on the website and making them available in one straightforward way for the public to access. I'll pause there real quick before I go to the next step, if anybody has any questions.
Any questions on the appendices in that process? Okay, great. What's next?
I just wanted to also update you on sort of on process reflection. At the last council meeting, we also spoke to the interest of putting out a survey that speaks to what we appreciated about the process that we just all went through over the last year, and where we can glean lessons learned to apply to the next iteration of the climate action plan, as well as our ongoing climate council and steering committee and subcommittee meetings. It's proving like more challenging maybe than I had anticipated in how to frame those questions in a way that feels both, I don't want to use this word lightly, but cathartic in a way for all of you to reflect on what you liked and didn't like about this process, but also ensure that it's a productive catalyst for us to grow and learn from in order to think about what processes look like in the coming year. And so our hope and expectation is still to get that survey out sooner rather than later. But regardless of the exact timeline, our hope and focus is that our meeting Our next council meeting will be on January 24th from 11 to 2. I'm not sure that we'll always meet on the fourth Monday of every month. The steering committee tomorrow will actually be talking about what the council sort of schedule and work process looks like for the coming year. But for now, recognizing Martin Luther King Day was the third week of January, and January 10th, in all honesty, just felt a little too soon to meet again. So we put it on January 24th. That meeting will be solely sort of focused on process as well as the coming year and work plan for the council. So stay tuned for a survey. For now, there is a survey that is active that I shared with you all at the end of last week around the application of the guiding principles and scoring rubric that Kaya Morris is requesting that you all fill out. That will hopefully inform how we utilize those principles and scoring rubrics through the implementation of the climate action plan. So if you didn't notice that, it was in the email on Friday, and we can resend it separately as well. I think there was one more next step. I think the last next step was just to let you know that there'll be an invitation for a meeting on January 24th from 11 to 2, and that will be our next council meeting. So that's all I had for next step.
Great. Okay. Any questions, reactions to those steps that Jane laid out? Okay. So there will be these two surveys, right? The one that's active right now from Kaya Morris that's really focused on the just transitions principles and rubric and thinking about that. And then one that Marion and Jane and others will develop, thinking more broadly about the overall process that we've had as a council. Okay, great. Okay, should we do some public comment then? So if you've been observing our meeting today, this is a great time. If you'd like to make a comment, feel free to raise your hand in Zoom. We're a pretty small crowd today, so if you're having a hard time finding the hand raised, just unmute yourself and let yourself be known. I'll just pause for a moment if anybody would like to make a comment. Feel free to use the chat at this point too, if that's more comfortable for you in making a comment. Okay. I'm just looking to see if any on the phone. I don't see any folks dialed in. Okay. All right. Last call on public comment. Okay, great. Okay, wonderful, everybody. Before we sign off for the day, is there anything else folks would want to share before we finish up our work today? June, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I don't know that Iris and Leslie Ann are still on the line, but I just wanted to publicly add my congratulations to their recent award, recognizing their excellent work on the council. It's always good to be associated with such a distinguished company. Thank you.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Fantastic. I know there's been some email traffic about that, but yes.
It's true.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, anything else before we finish up? All right. Okay, folks, we did it. 2021, as Jane said, we made it to 2021. We didn't just make it through, we did an amazing amount of work this year. Everybody deserves a break. Happy holidays. If you're still gonna celebrate holidays, for certainly we'll be all celebrating a new year. We'll see you in January. Take care, everybody. Be well. Rest.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Terrific work. Thanks, David.
Best, everybody.